The session today is, as you know, it's about character and the process of inventing characters, creating characters, and then living with those characters. Because in the case of both our writers today, they've created characters who they have written about for several decades, which is in itself an amazing achievement and sets up particular disciplines both for the authors and for readers. Let me just formally introduce you to both of them. Frank Moorhouse, on my far right, completed the extraordinary Edith trilogy that he began with Grand Days in 1993 with the publication of Cold Light last year. Frank is one of Australia's finest writers. He's written fiction, non-fiction, screenplays and essays, including quite a number of essays for Griffith Review, which I edit. And he's edited many other collections of writing. Among his many awards, Frank has seen 4017 named Book of the Year by The Age and the moral winner of the Booker Prize by the London magazine called Blitz. Grand Days won the South Australia Premier's Award for Fiction. Dark Palace won the 2001 Miles Franklin Literary Award and was shortlisted for many other awards. He was made a member of the Order of Australia for services to literature in 1985. And I should just give a little plug. His memoir, If You Know Burke, You Know Australia, is the lead essay in the next issue of Griffith Review, which will come out early in May, with the title, What is Australia For? So please join with me in welcoming Frank Moorhouse. Garry Disher grew up here in South Australia. He also is an enormously prolific writer. He's written more than 40 books, literary fiction, crime, children's, young adult, short stories and writers' handbooks. To make a career as a writer, you've really got to turn your hand to many different forms and genres and styles of writing. His Wyatt books, set in the murky world of the professional hold-up man, have been published around the world to great acclaim. This series, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, includes Kickback, Pay Dirt, Death Deal, Cross Kill, Port Vila Blues and The Fallout, all great titles. Garry's also well known for his Chalice and Destry detective series. This series includes Kitty Hawk Down and Chain of Evidence, and his most recent book, Whispering Death, all of which have also won many prizes. His prizes include the German Crime Prize twice and the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction in both 2007 and 2010. So please welcome Garry. So let's start by talking about how you create these characters. Garry, do you want to tell us a bit about your two big sets of characters, I guess the Wyatt character and then the Chalice and Destry characters?
I take two different approaches with these two series, but we work within a tradition. I have to thank the hard-boiled American crime tradition for Wyatt in particular. I loved some of the books and authors of the 60s and 70s, like Richard Stark, gave me the idea for a criminal character. But Wyatt doesn't grow. A rule of thumb is that, as Catherine Ann Porter said, first have faith in your theme, then get to know your characters so well that they live and grow in your imagination exactly as if you saw them in the flesh, and tell their story with all the truth and tenderness and severity that you're capable of. There's a sense there of, through a series, of the character growing, but Wyatt doesn't change. I don't know much about him. It would spoil it for me if I did know anything about him. I have faith in my theme. The theme is that Wyatt robs banks, and after a few things go wrong, he ultimately gets away with it. But he doesn't change. Character is action, and we learn about him by seeing him behave when faced by challenges. It would spoil it for me if I knew that his father had beaten him when he was a kid, or he's nursing some sort of secret hurt. That doesn't make him tick. But the Chalice and Destry series is quite different. The characters do have an inner life. We see them in all sorts of circumstances, and they grow through the series. They change subtly from book to book.
So just to tease that out for me a little bit more, I mean, so in the Wyatt character, his character emerges through his responses to what he's engaged in, the situations you put him in. Whereas the Chalice and Destry characters, they do move. I mean, you know, they evolve. You know, things happen in their lives. I mean, I think actually in the first of those books you give a snapshot of what's happened before in Chalice's life.
Yes, they're much more deeply layered books, and I like to tease personality trays out through seeing characters in a domestic setting, in the workplace, responding to strain. And as the books progress, one character will be in a troubled marriage in the first book, and by the book 4 she's divorced, for example. So there's a slow shift. As part of the texturing of that series. But the Wyatt is quite different. We needn't know anything about him, really. He's not robbing banks to pay for his niece's leukemia operation or anything like that. He just robs banks. And
that's what he does.
What does he do with his money? Tell me again. Remind me.
Well, sometimes he loses it.
Which means he has to rob another bank.
Is he ever robbed? I can't remember him being robbed.
Yeah, sometimes the loot is snatched away from him, but ultimately he gets it back.
So I'll come back to talking a little bit about how you relate to those characters in your head while you're writing them. But let me just bring Frank into the conversation now, because your character of Edith in these great novels, she clearly does change. It's all about her rich life, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yes. For those who are not familiar with the trilogy, the first book, Grand Days, begins in the 1920s with the establishment of the League of Nations in Geneva, the world's first attempt at an international collaboration to run the planet. And the second book is Dark Palace, which tells more about another part of Edith's life where where the League of Nations collapses. Dark Palace, the Palace of Nations collapses. And the third book, Cold Light, is in the end of her life, where she's returned to Australia. She was a young woman who grew up in Australia and who went to Geneva to get a job in the League of Nations, as many, many young people did all over the world. So in many ways, this had brewed and simmered and cooked in my mind since high school. What happened at the League of Nations was an ongoing dilemma. I didn't know why it didn't work, and so ultimately in mid-career I decided that it was time for me to go to Geneva and discover and create novels there. So I mean, it wasn't really a simple undertaking. First of all, I was writing from I was going to tell the story from another gender's point of view. Secondly, I was going to another country which I didn't know, and I was going back into the 1920s when I wasn't alive. So I'd set myself a few challenges, but they didn't feel like challenges. And this is the strange thing about when the book is ready, when the student is ready, the pupil is ready, the master appears. Well, I think when the writer is ready, the book will suggest itself, and you know where to begin. And so I went to Geneva to live and started to create the character. I looked at a career path in the League of Nations of a young woman in the Secretariat. Remember, the League of Nations was composed like the UN as a council, as an assembly of diplomats, and then the working staff, the Secretariat, who kept it all going. And she was in the Secretariat. So I went into the files and I searched for an Australian woman who had been there in my time frame. It was conceived as the books were conceived to run through the life of the League of Nations. I couldn't find an Australian woman, so I discovered, with the help of the old archivist, no one had been in the League of Nations archives for 15, 20 years. I wandered in and an unknown Australian, and there was an old Swede who was sleeping at his desk, and he was in charge of the archive. And he together became helpful in me tracing ultimately a Canadian woman, Mary McGeechee, who had been in the Secretariat and fitted my time frame. And also the wonderful thing is that she was a very innovative and active and committed member of the Secretariat with high ambitions, and she wrote many memos and had many ideas, and she argued with her fellow staff, and all this was written down in the margins of reports and in the margins of letters and internal correspondence. And so I ultimately had a wonderful paper trail of this woman's career going through.
Did she help you formulate the character of Edith?
Well, yes, even secretariat papers and internal arguments reveal character. And so I gradually pictured her.
So what was the point that she took off in your imagination from the sort of research-intensive process of seeing the record of this other woman to becoming somebody that you've created? Because your Edith goes a long way beyond that now, or she has for all her life, really, in the book.
Well, yes. As we were walking over, I said to Julianne, we could start at the shallow end and go into the deep end of character creation, how the author decides on the right from a woman to create a woman character, and why in Geneva, and why in the League of Nations. So there are lots of throws up quite a number of questions there.
She's in your last chapter of 4017, isn't she? But was that before you went to Geneva, or was that after, when she first appears as the character in the peacekeeping mission?
Well, yes, she wasn't fully fleshed, but yes, she appears in an earlier book of mine called 4017, where she's a diplomat and she's on a mission in Vienna, and she has a 40-year-old minder aide with her, and from DFAT, from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and that's where we meet Edith. But by then she was a very minor character in that book. But she does mention that she once was an officer in the League of Nations, and the 40-year-old aide doesn't pay any attention and doesn't ask her any questions. So in some ways,
but you hadn't gone to Geneva yet when you wrote that.
Oh no.
So she was there already.
That was in the mind. Yes, my creative mind, imagination had now, without me knowing quite why, had now moved her into fiction, into my fiction in that book as a minor character. But I wasn't aware that she was going to be a major character and take up 21 years of my life. But I knew that after at some point, it's so intuitive. It's so intuitive, and the imagination doesn't give you many warnings, and it doesn't really. The imagination seems to me to be very resistant to planning, and the imagination doesn't like whiteboards with dates and places and events and a forward plan.
Yeah.
So one, as Hemingway said, one honest sentence will suggest the next honest sentence, and you go on to write the book.
Interesting. Garry, do you have characters who move between your books, or are they all, the Wyatt characters in the Wyatt books, the Chalice characters in the Chalice books, and the other characters in your other works, they don't pop back up into other pieces?
No, I keep them separate from each other. I think if Inspector Chalice were to be chasing Wyatt, it's a postmodern trick, and I don't want to have a bar of it. Yeah. But characters do live in my imagination after a book is finished. One of my novels is a World War II novel called Past the Headlands. There's a young English orphan in the book, and she's still alive in my head. I'd like to write about her one day.
So I'm interested in that process, especially when you're writing these books that have, or these series of books that have such a long engagement with a character. I mean, do you feel almost like these characters are a part of your life? I mean, when you step away from the computer, away from the writing space, into your normal domain, are the characters there with you, sort of on your shoulder as well?
To a certain degree, yes. I had a holiday in Noosa last year, and walking around the little canals and seeing some of those costly houses, I could see Wyatt there casing out the joint. And I live on the Mornington Peninsula, which is the setting of the Chalice and Destry novels. And to me, those novels are about a place and a way of life as much as they are stories of a crime and detection. Yeah. And I see somewhere new or read something in the local paper about an event on the peninsula, and in my imagination, weave the characters into it.
So do you do what Frank's just said that he doesn't do? I mean, he talks about one honest sentence following another. I mean, do your novels more elaborately plotted with whiteboards and schemas and all the rest of it?
It's not quite as formal as that. It's just scraps of A4 paper. But yeah, I do plan in minute detail. I didn't always used to do that. With my earlier books and short stories were so-called literary ones, and I used the approach of Shauna Phelan, having a character, a situation and a promise. If those three elements are there at the start, the writing then becomes a voyage of discovery. And I tried that approach with the first crime novel and it just didn't work. And I now plan in minute detail.
So you know the ending, you know the solutions to the crimes and so on.
Yeah. But also I'm trying to stay a step ahead of the reader, and I'm trying to subvert the reader's expectations with reversals and turning points, withholding tactics, all those sorts of tricks of the trade. But at the same time, though, I trust my instincts, as Frank alluded to before, that if they take me away from the plan, I'll always follow my instincts and jettison the plan.
So Frank, tell us about your...
Well, I was going to just add something there, that of course the computer, my trilogy began when was written on my first computer, and it was called a luggable. There were no laptops, but it was the size of a suitcase, and it was it was the Porsche of the shop assistant said this is the Porsche of personal computers. and what I've realised is that you can, to create a trilogy of a large trilogy or a series of characters and events, that the beauty of the computer is that you can create remarkable number of support files. And Edith would have 100 or more files about her habits and about her relationships and about her taste in clothing and things that I'd created, so that you do have while I don't have a whiteboard, I certainly have a massive data about her and all the other characters who have their biographical files too.
And so is that as an aid memoir for you as you're writing, so you don't trip over yourself in terms of what's happened before or what?
Yes, at a simple level, it allows you to check when she started smoking or when she dropped smoking, and with some things that you wouldn't necessarily, because these are very long books and they're over a long time. But yes, it's a sort of a concordance. A concordance is what it is, where you are able to check. The first concordance, I think, was with the Bible, and it's a wonderful book. There's a Bible concordance. There are a number where you can, if you want to find out how many times the word lamb is and where it is in the Bible, or how many times Jesus, what he wore on various occasions, you can find that in the Bible.
What the weather was on a given day.
And what the weather was when he was crucified, and so on. But yes, there's that.
So just tell me a little bit, I'm interested in the process of that. I mean, is that material, do you collate it as you're going along?
As you're going along, yeah. And it builds up and builds up. And there are also, my work has all that. I had a lot balls in the air. I have juggling all the history of that period, which she is involved in, and of course, the fictional books also have real life characters, and there I have to do. And whenever they speak or act or involved in events, I feel that I have to root that in historical a sort of source.
Sure.
And so I did a lot of research on real people as well as creating.
Yeah.
What about consistency of personality through the books, or how? To what extent do you allow her to change?
Well. As I said, I had no hesitation in seeing that the major book, Grand Days, would be set in Geneva. It would be set in the early part of the 20s when the League was getting going. I knew that she was she changes her age herself during the three books. She starts off. She puts her age up to get a job at the League.
She's a lady. She's allowed to fib about her age.
Yeah, and she drops she gets married midlife and drops her age by 7 years, and so there's. But she's so I play around with that. But of course, when I mentioned earlier the deep end. It's all very well for me to talk about following a paper trail, but where is Edith coming from in me as a writer? And this is getting down into the deeper end. Obviously, it draws a lot on my mother, who was active in public life at a small level, at state level and local level, in Red Cross and Country Women's Association and Girl Guides, organisations such as those, and but was active. I mean, she was, when she died, a couple of people said she was the best chairperson chairman that we ever had in Nowra, and so she also chaired the dining table and the breakfast table in my house. So she was a civic person, and I obviously constructed Edith out of her. But then we moved, as my therapist would point out, we moved then to, and in writing theory, there's a lot of talk about androgyny and in the imagination being androgynous. That is we are, as our personalities are formed from a male and a female, not only genetically but through our conditioning and upbringing and the way our temperaments evolve, and the strength of our mother and father in our life, in the struggle for our personalities as the parents struggle for the possession of the child. So there is this androgyny in the imagination, which, that is, we are male and female, and that it is possible, and as I say, there's a lot of talk over the century about the role of androgyny and the drawing on in my case, the drawing on the mother within, the female within, and entering into that. And of course, again, as my therapist would say, I think I said to her that there is a father book and that we all write, and a mother book we all write, and she pointed out that my father book, which was called The Electrical Experience, which was about his generation and life as an entrepreneur in a small town, was this big, and I've written 3 books this big about which are my mother books. Say no more, she said. So, but this is a very intricate in terms of working as a writer and working with the imagination. One is therefore also making part of my personality into becomes the character.
Yeah. And
my personality, and sometimes I would argue that in some ways the books became my personality, and Edith became my personality as much as the books drew on my personality. So it's a dynamic which is very tricky and probably very dangerous, and
especially if you're being
probably made me into the ruin that I am.
Well, especially if you're being Ambrose and Edith at the same time. I mean, that could be quite
throw in a transvestite husband, and you've got the picture.
So, Garry, how does that strike? I mean, is one part of you a criminal and the other part of you is a policeman? I mean, is that the split in your personality?
I think so. I think part of the appeal of crime fiction is that it appeals to a darker side of ourselves. There's the side of us that would like to see the bad guys punished, because I think we all have a sense of powerlessness. We read the newspapers and arseholes are getting away with it all the time, and we are hedged in by doubts and scruples, and it's nice to read about a character who's not. And it's nice to see justice restored, but at the same time there's a side of us that would like to pull the perfect bank robbery. But I'd like to get back to what Frank was talking about, the male and the female. I think my strongest fictional characters have been women in several books, crime and otherwise. I find women easier to write about. And
do you get that
fact,
feedback from your female readers as well, that your female characters have a...
I do get that, but they also like Wyatt.
Mm.
Most of my readers are women, and they like Wyatt. They say to me, I don't approve of him, but I want him to win.
And so are you conscious in that male and female thing in terms of your own sort of psychology that you're drawing on?
I hadn't thought it through as much as Frank.
Right, okay. Yeah.
But I remember one of my novels, it's a South Australian novel incidentally, called The Sunken Road. I knew I wanted to write about the small town, small farm environment I grew up in the mid-north. And I thought I was going to write about a farmer, but he wouldn't live in my imagination. And it occurred to me that my father's here, and no offence, Dad, but when I went home to the farm, I loved going out with my father to tend the sheep or whatever it might be, but I also liked hearing the women in the family gossip. And I realised then that I wanted to write about a woman. Mm. And the book took off then after me struggling to find life for it for 2 or 3 years.
Interesting. Frank, have you had that process with finding the right voice in that sense of I suppose the Edith books, once you got the formula, not, I don't say formula in a pejorative sense, but once you got the character, it took a life of its own in a sense, didn't it?
Well, yes, this has been said at 100. Most of you out there have probably heard writers say this at various festival meetings, at groups like this, and it's always somehow hard to get across or explain that the characters that we create do actually... you are setting up a psychological dynamic on the page, and that they are interacting, and it's not all foreseeable, and it's not all controllable, and that once the story has formed, the narrative has formed, and the characters are formed, then all you are doing is somehow managing that dynamic that you created. And that's why when you get up in the morning and go to your computer, the first thing I want to do when I wake up in the morning is start writing. I don't want to do anything else, and I know that during that day there are going to be huge surprises and in what my characters say, and huge surprises in what they do to each other. And this is one of the... It's miraculous when you're the writer, and it's very difficult to communicate as a... It's not a trance-like state, but it's somewhere like that, and the character and the narrative does, its dynamic does draw you and pull you and push you. And I had also feeding in history, and I had although I didn't have a whiteboard plan, I had the beginning of the League and the end of the League, and then further on, the aftermath of the League. There were historical markers and there were historical frames that I could work within.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that historical stuff and how you position these characters in real events, because it seems to me that you both do that one in different ways. One of the real strengths, I think, of Cold Light, Frank, is where you take real events and put Edith in the real events, Edith and Ambrose and the whole crew, in the real events as though they were there, but without detracting from the truth as we know it about the situation. And one of the examples which stays with my mind very vividly was being in Parliament when Menzies was giving the speech about the anti-communist bill, and you have Ambrose sitting there and you have Edith sitting there, you have the Canadian consul commenting on the speech as it's been given in the Parliament, and it's as though there's somebody else in the public gallery. I mean, it's a very clever exercise because you're not fabricating it, you're just intruding something else into the process.
Yes, In many of the cases, there would have been a person like Edith in meetings and taking minutes, or, of course, or servicing the meeting, so that in a position in the interior of section, the management of the building, it gave her a lot of entree to various things in a sort of plausibility sense. It's plausible. But then, well, yes, then she moves into really real things that really happened, like Menzies did give that speech, and his words are used in the chapter. And of course I'm absolutely impressed by Ambrose's, not Edith. Edith is listening to this whispered commentary between the Canadian consul and Ambrose, her husband, who's an English diplomat, and he's with the British High Commission in Canberra, and they're listening to this, and the consul general, as you say, and Ambrose are analysing Menzies' speech as though they were marking him as, they said it was straight out of the lower fifth form.
Sort of debating technique, yeah.
And I was so impressed by Ambrose's analysis of Menzies' speech. It was brilliant.
It is. It's actually it's one of many very fantastic chapters in that book. But it is interesting, that process. And Garry, I'm interested to the extent that you're obviously absorbing the milieu of real crimes and events in that Mornington Peninsula area and more generally. It seems to me that there's a really interesting sort of thing that all novelists have to deal with, and that is to the extent that something is real and true and documentable, and to the extent that it's completely a work of the imagination, and how you draw those lines, where your character takes on a life which actually goes beyond the real.
I think Frank will probably attest to this, but if you're writing a novel set with a historical setting, and I've written three or four novels set in the past, and done an enormous amount of research, but only perhaps 10% of the research finds its way to the page. But you need the other 90% there in your head to give life to it, to give a sense of verisimilitude. And
you've got to feel safe.
Yeah, that's right.
It makes you feel safe about what the characters are doing.
Yeah, and I think it's okay to bend the truth for the sake of art, if it's not going to offend too many readers. But sometimes, though, I've encountered readers who've said to me after reading one of my Peninsula novels, you know that nature reserve you talk about in Chain of Evidence, I went to look for it and it's not there.
I had a reader yesterday, or after my Saturday session, who came up to me and was very disturbed and said, I'm glad to meet you, and I love the books, and I love Edith, but I can't believe Edith would have forged the signature of the Secretary General of the League of Nations. This was Edith forges the signature so as to get a chair that she wants into the League of Nations building. I mean, it wasn't as though she was declaring war on Austria. But she was so angry about a chair that had been donated by orphans, war orphans, and she wanted it desperately to be that it was designed and created by this is true. Serbian war orphans had spent a year making this chair, a throne for the president of the League of Nations who would save the world, and they created this throne, and the Secretary General and the Council had said, we can't accept gifts like this, we can't accept any gifts because all the rooms are planned by countries. There was a Swedish room and the Danish room, and there was not to be any paintings on the walls, and there were whole sorts of rules about the interior design of the Palace of Nations, which, by the way, when you're in Geneva you should go and see the palace, do the tour of the Palace of Nations. It was the first building that the world ever owned in common. However, Edith, this chair arrives, and they were going to send it back to the orphans and say, no, we can't accept it. And she was infuriated by this, so she just wrote a letter accepting the chair and signed the secretary. But my reader, my dear reader, said to me, I don't believe she would have done that.
That raises a number of interesting questions. I mean, about what readers' expectations are of the characters. And I mean, I know I've heard other people talking about the Edith characters, and young women especially saying that they ask themselves, what would Edith do in this situation? And that's become a bit of a gag that is around, of people sort of testing themselves against this woman. But I wonder, to the extent to which you're conscious of your readers when you're creating the characters, what their expectations are, and how you shape your characters. You know, you obviously I would imagine that in both your cases, you'd love readers to start at the beginning and read through, but you also want people to be able to come into the books partway through the trilogy or the sequence and still find them accessible. So I'm just sort of interested in how you're conscious of your readers in the creation of a character that makes them accessible at different points for people dropping in and out of the books.
I think there are 2 points there. One is being fair to your reader when you are writing a series, and to a certain extent I try to be. I know that people are going to pick up book number 4 of the Chalice and Destry novels, for example, and I try to allude to things that might have happened in the past without giving too much background. I think stories have to be all foreground and not too much background. But I'll let slip a sentence or two here, perhaps give a history of a marriage, whatever. But
right. Yeah.
Otherwise, though, I don't think about the reader.
Yeah. Yeah.
I please myself.
Yeah. Okay. Frank, what about you? You're thinking about your readers, what they need to know, what they don't need to know. What they expect.
Only you have to make a judgment about how much backgrounding you need to give to a writer about, say, the Locarno Treaty. How much information does the reader need to make sense of what's happening here, and do you have to explain who Briand is, the French Prime Minister, and how much you have to, and that's a matter of judgment and feel, and I also, right from the beginning, I used historical notes at the back of the book to give information about certain organisations and events and people who figure in the book, and there's a who's who at the back of the book that identifies who the real people are and who the fictional people are. Someone once said that your notes at the back are the best thing, and and she said it was very postmodern because they're really like another chapter of the book.
One of the things, Garry, I was saying before that in your Dragon Man, which is the first of the Chalice series, isn't it? Yeah. There's a quite nice sort of device that you use in there, which struck me when I was reading it. And he said, over the years, the hardness had grown. He was more suspicious than he used to be. The job was more violent now. You saw some ugly things, like dead people, like syringes or speed or dope on kitchen tables in full view of little kids. Tankard was full of frustrations. He was no longer sure what was right and what was wrong, and nor did he care. And one of the things that struck me, that this was at the beginning of what we now know as 4 books, but in a way you've created a backstory early on to sort of position, to hint at something that reveals itself more as it goes along. Yeah,
I haven't burdened the reader too much, though. It gives a brief snapshot of what this young policeman is like. And as the books progress, we do see that he's he's sexist, a bit of a bully, very narrow-minded, ready to use his fists if necessary. But I think if I were to go on for pages, it would...
it would bore people. Bore people to tears. Well, no, it wouldn't bore people. You don't need it because I mean, that's the point about it being all foreground and not background. That you get there through the action. Yeah.
You have... I'm interested in one of the big differences that emerged when you were talking between us is that you would never, and which I understand because you're working within those a genre series, and you'd never have the characters meet in a bar from one book to another, or the police officer would never find himself fishing next to Wyatt, and of course I have in Cold Light, my last book, which is my 14th book, I have characters from my second book, Electrical Experience, appear in the last book, and so in many ways the books, all my books, in a strange sort of way, have a linkage, a magnetic bearing, if you like, right back to not to the first book, but And but that wasn't a plan either. So the books are continuous in a very, very, very loose way.
But it is interesting because it suggests that those characters have a life, which actually goes beyond the immediacy of the particular
They live,
book.
yes.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
characters live forever.
Yeah.
I realise now
Yeah.
that T. George MacDowell from the second book, which was my father book, probably my father forcing himself into my mother's book.
That's
Not
right.
saying, oh, I was there too.
They're lovely scenes, those ones in Berry, yeah. Now, we've got time for questions. I don't know whether people want to talk about questions for the audience. Is there?
Hi, I would like to ask the both of you, I know there are some readers who interpret certain characters in a totally different way how the writers plan them to be. So, how do you find when your readers interpret your characters in a totally different way than you initially designed them to be? Do you find it strange or amusing?
Well, yes. When I was starting out as a writer, I was working with short stories mainly, and of course, I realised one of the first great negotiations you have to make with life if you start to write is you've got to make some sort of contract or a treaty with your intimate friends, your lover, your partners. There's going to be there has to be some sort of terrific demand made on them, because they're going to say, my God, that's what we did last night. and then you have a friend coming up and saying, is that me? Is that how you see me? And you think, no, that I didn't even... You realise that people's own image and your image of them and other people's, their boss's image of them and their wife's image of them and their brother's image of them, and there are many, we are many selves. We contain in ourselves a multitude of selves, and sometimes the writer, the reader sees themselves in a book in a story where they're in my mind they're not there at all. And you realise that, oh, that's somehow how he sees himself.
I fortunately don't have friends come up and say to me, I hate the way you've portrayed me.
Especially your criminal friends.
But all your crim friends must all think they're white, don't they?
They do.
When you go down to the bar.
I was a writer in residence in Queensland a few years ago, which entailed my visiting all the prisons, and there's some tough, nasty prisons in and around Brisbane. And all the guys who came to the writing workshops had read the Wyatt novels and were convinced that I had crim friends, or I could help them rob a payroll van when they got out. But getting back to how characters are seen compared to how I see them, I have a few of my books have been studied at school and university level over the years. Most recently, The Divine Wind, which is set in Broome during the Second World War. It was a Year 12 book in Victoria for many years. And I did a lot of school visits, and it used to astound me and dismay me, the view that some of the kids and teachers had of my characters. They saw them quite differently from me. But all I could say is this is how I see them, how you see them, and if you can give a convincing argument in your end of year exam for why you see them like that, that's fine.
So what was an example of how they saw things so very differently? That's sort of interesting in a text which is set, in that sort of context.
Perhaps it's just adolescents seeing the world in very black and white terms.
Sure.
But to me, the characters in that particular novel had all kinds of subtle shades of so-called good and bad in them. But these kids didn't see it like that.
Interesting. One of the things that I'm sort of interested in with both your books, and although our conversation is about character, it seems to me that very much what you're both doing through these very strong characters that you've created and imagined and put on the page is exploring big issues it's big issues about the way we live, the way the world works, how things hang together. And I'm just sort of interested in your thoughts on the sort of the purpose, in a way, beyond the craft and beyond the art and beyond the character. What do you want the legacy of the books to be? Garry?
I don't want to beat the reader over the head with a message. Certainly not. But I can't help but, in the crime novels, touch on prevailing social tensions. I think they are part of what makes us tick. I think, and Frank clearly doesn't belong in this camp, but I think literary fiction has often let us down. It might be strong on gorgeous prose and absorbing characterisation, all the rest of it, but it doesn't tell us about the world we live in often. Whereas I think contemporary crime novels do. They're a barometer for what's happening in society. A good crime novel, I think.
And so it gives it insight that people are able to engage with in a way that goes beyond what they experience or read about in the media.
Yeah.
You're right, Garry, about literary fiction. That in Cold Light, Edith exclaims at one point, "You never find a poet at a meeting. They never write a poem about being at a meeting or a negotiation of a treaty."
Gina Reinhardt does. But you, Frank, you've talked in the past about how when you were a student studying history, and there was a couple of lines about the League of Nations, and then you got onto World War II, and then you're into something else, and it was gone in a flash. So it was a way of trying to make sense of a forgotten bit of history that had some resonance at the time that you then came back to the story. So I mean, we're all obviously very interested in international relations now, but
yeah, and there seemed to me that, again, I'll join with Garry here in criticising some of our, what we call the serious fiction or literary fiction of Australia, that they have almost a disdain for the life of a bureaucrat, and there's huge drama in offices and and civilization is being advanced in arguments and memos. That's how evolution is going. Evolution occurs through memos, discussions and meetings, and there is great drama, even though it may not feel like it at the time, but step back from it and there are great dramas occurring, and that's the way civilization evolves. And that some of our fiction writers have been disdainful of, say, the bureaucrat, and they can only write about public servants satirically, and they can only write about politicians satirically, and they have a disdain for commerce. They can't see the drama of business, of the small business person. There's been I think if there is a failure in our serious writing, it's in those areas of not being able to enter in, of not having the imaginative reach to go into those lives which are part of the very, very, very sinews and muscles of the way we live, the society.
I think you're right about that, Frank. I mean, I think that there is a tendency to write about the stuff that is visible and obvious. But one of the things that I think is clear in both your writing is you've imagined women as they participate in the world now, in a way that, wasn't always represented in fiction. I mean, your women are both very active, they're very engaged, they're complex characters who have a professional life and a personal life and hold it together. That's just something that you felt. I mean, I'm interested in that, whether there's a gender dimension in what you're doing with those characters.
Well, I didn't just decide I'd better have strong female characters because most of my readers are women. It just
felt.
It grew. It grew naturally for me.
Yeah.
But I did find that a couple of the female characters in the Chalice and Destry series grew in stature as the books progressed, so that Sergeant Destry, who's just an offsider in the first book, by the fourth book, partly set in South Australia incidentally, she's the main character. And the young detective Pam Murphy, we see her progress from being a patrol constable to detective training, and now she's a young detective. But they interest me. Workplace tensions that they encounter interest me.
All right. Well, look, I would like to ask you to join with me in thanking the authors for sharing some of the secrets of their character creations with us today, and encourage you to join them in the bookshop by buying their books and letting them sign them for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.